The winter of 1883 came down on the Nebraska plains like a hammer. It was not a gentle descent into slumber, not a soft blanket of white, but a sudden, violent assault. The sky, which for months had been a vast and indifferent blue, turned the color of slate, and the wind began a low moan that would not cease for 5 months. For the settlers of the small, hopeful town of Providence, it was their first winter in this new land, and the land was not welcoming. It was a place of immense, soul-crushing emptiness, a sea of grass that offered no shield and no quarter. The central problem was simple, as fundamental as breath itself. There were no trees. The prairie rolled on in every direction, an endless, undulating wave of brown, frozen earth, interrupted only by the settlers' own crude, sod houses. To the east, a full day's journey by wagon, was the Platte River, and along its banks grew thin, scraggly cottonwoods. They were the only source of wood, the only fuel the settlers knew, and they were already becoming scarce. The cold did not knock before it entered their homes. It seeped through the sod walls, slithered through the cracks in the window frames, and breathed its icy breath across the dirt floors. It was a thief in the night, stealing warmth and strength. The people of Providence were not weak. They were farmers and blacksmiths, carpenters and preachers, men and women who had crossed an ocean or a continent on the strength of a promise. They had built their homes with their own hands, cutting bricks of prairie turf, which they called Nebraska marble, and stacking them into thick, solid walls. These soddies were meant to be warm in winter and cool in summer, but they were no match for the relentless, searching wind of a plains blizzard. The cold was a physical presence, an enemy that laid siege to their small fortifications. Every family struggled. The daily ritual was the same, a constant, desperate feeding of the small iron stoves that sat in the center of their single-room homes. A man would spend a week making the perilous trip to the river and back, his wagon loaded with a precious cord of green, sputtering cottonwood, only to watch it disappear in a matter of days. The smoke that rose from their chimneys was thin and pale, a testament to their dwindling supplies. Inside, families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air. Frost grew on the inside of the walls, delicate, beautiful, and deadly. It was a universal problem, a shared suffering that bound the community in a fellowship of fear. Among them lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, having lost her husband to a fever on the journey west. She had arrived late in the season, with her 2 small children, a boy named Liam and a girl named Sophie, their faces pale and serious. Her sod house was smaller than the others, set a little apart from the main cluster of dwellings, as if she were an afterthought. The community regarded her with a mixture of pity and concern. They saw a woman alone, without a man to haul wood or break the stubborn prairie soil. They saw her as fragile, unprepared, a tragedy waiting to happen. Ilara was quiet and observant. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was soft, with the faint, lyrical accent of the old country she had left behind. While other women spent their days worrying over diminishing woodpiles and patching drafty walls, Ilara did something strange. She would walk out onto the frozen prairie, her children bundled tightly beside her, and she would search the ground. She was not looking for firewood. She was looking for something else, something the land offered in abundance. Her novel idea was born not of invention, but of memory. She remembered her grandmother, in a land just as treeless and windswept as this one, speaking of the prairie's gift. She had watched the native peoples who had passed through months earlier, their movements efficient and wise, and she had noted what they used for their fires. So, as the autumn winds grew colder, Ilara began to gather dried bison and cattle dung. The settlers called them chips. They were everywhere, baked hard by the summer sun, scattered across the plains like dark, flat stones. She would fill her sack day after day, her children helping, their small, mittened hands picking up the frozen discs. They would haul their bounty back to their small home and stack it carefully against the south-facing wall, under a lean-to she had constructed from scavenged planks. The pile grew steadily, a strange, dark mound that puzzled her neighbors. It was a monument to her foolishness, they thought, a testament to her desperation. The community's reaction was swift and predictable. It began with confused whispers, which soon turned to open mockery. Thomas, the town's most respected builder, a large, practical man whose own cabin was the sturdiest in the settlement, felt it his duty to intervene. He strode over to her property one afternoon, his face a mask of stern concern. He saw the great pile of dried dung and shook his head, his breath a white cloud in the frigid air. "Woman," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "what is this foolishness? You cannot heat your home with dirt." He gestured to the pile with a dismissive wave of his thick-fingered hand. "This will not burn, and if it does, it will fill your home with a foul smoke. It is unhealthy. It is dangerous for your children." Ilara listened patiently, her hands tucked into the thin fabric of her apron. She looked at the man, at the certainty in his eyes, and then at her growing pile of fuel. "It will burn," she said softly. "It is what my grandmother used. It is what the earth provides when it does not provide trees." Thomas let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Your grandmother did not face a Nebraska winter," he declared. "This is not the old country. This is a hard land, and it requires hard fuel. It requires wood. You are wasting your time and endangering your children. People are talking. They say you've lost your senses to grief." He pointed toward the river, a faint, dark line on the horizon. "That is where warmth lies, not on the ground." His words spread through the settlement like a prairie fire. The men would chuckle as they passed her soddy, making jokes about Ilara's fuel. The women would watch her from their windows, shaking their heads with pity. "Poor thing," they would say to one another. "She'll learn her lesson when the first real freeze comes. Let's hope someone takes in those poor children before it's too late." The laughter was not always cruel, but it was constant. It was the derisive sound of a community so certain in its own wisdom that it could not recognize another kind. She was an outcast, her idea a source of public amusement. Despite the mockery, despite the isolation, Ilara worked on. She worked with a quiet, unyielding diligence. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the cold. In the morning, she would secure her home, checking the seals around the single window, patching any cracks in the sod walls with a mixture of clay and grass. Then she and the children would venture out, their faces wrapped in scarves, their eyes scanning the vast, frozen landscape. The work was hard. The chips were often frozen to the ground, and she had to use a small spade to pry them loose. Her fingers, even inside her worn gloves, would grow numb with cold. She did not gather indiscriminately. She had learned from memory and observation that the best chips were from the bison, dense and fibrous from their diet of grass. They had to be completely dry, aged by the sun and wind until they were as light and hard as pieces of wood. She would tap each one, listening for the correct hollow sound. She was a connoisseur of a material others saw only as waste. Her patience was a thing of wonder. While her neighbors made frantic, desperate trips for wood, Ilara made slow, methodical circuits of the prairie around her home, gathering her fuel one piece at a time. While Ilara worked with precision, the rest of the community continued with their flawed methods. They saw Thomas reinforcing his cabin, stuffing more mud and grass into the chinks between his cottonwood logs. They saw other men returning from the river, their wagons only half full, their faces grim. The wood they brought back was green and wet. It hissed and sputtered in their stoves, producing more smoke than heat. It was a battle they were visibly losing, yet they clung to their traditions, to the belief that wood was the only answer. Their frantic efforts were a stark contrast to Alara's calm, steady labor. She was preparing. They were reacting. Her innovation was not just the fuel itself, but the system she designed to use it. Her small iron stove was meant for wood, with a wide grate that would allow the smaller pieces of dung to fall through unburned. So, with painstaking effort, she modified it. She found a sheet of metal from a broken barrel, and using a hammer and a nail, punched dozens of small holes in it. She fitted this new, finer grate into her stove. This would allow air to circulate from below, while holding the fuel in a compact mass, ensuring a slow, even burn. She also paid attention to the flue. She cleaned it meticulously, ensuring a clear, strong draft. She learned how to stack the chips inside the stove, a foundation of larger pieces on the bottom, with smaller bits filling the gaps. It was a science she developed through trial and error. When she lit the first fire, the smoke was thin and surprisingly clean. There was an earthy, grassy smell, but it was not foul. And the heat was astonishing. It was not the sharp, aggressive heat of a roaring wood fire, but a deep, penetrating, radiant warmth that seemed to soak into the very walls of the sod house. It was the steady, reliable heat of embers, and it lasted for hours. The great storm arrived in the second week of December. It did not come with a warning. One afternoon, the sky simply vanished, replaced by a churning, horizontal wall of white. The wind, which had been a constant moan, rose to a terrifying, shrieking howl like a beast of prey. The settlers called it a white hurricane. It was a blizzard of legendary proportions, a storm that would be spoken of for generations. The temperature plummeted, dropping to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. The snow was not soft and fluffy. It was fine and hard, like sand, and it was driven by the wind with such force that it scoured the paint from the few wooden doors in the settlement. For the community of Providence, the crisis had arrived. The storm was the ultimate test of their preparations, and their preparations were found wanting. The wind was a relentless predator, finding every tiny crack, every weak point in their homes. The fine granular snow was pushed through keyholes and under doorways, forming delicate crystalline drifts on their floors. The most immediate problem, however, was fuel. The blizzard made any trip outside impossible, let alone a journey to the river. They were trapped with whatever wood they had on hand. Inside Thomas's cabin, which had been the envy of the settlement, the situation was dire. He had what he considered a generous woodpile, but the ferocious cold demanded a constant, roaring fire. He fed log after log into his stove, but the heat seemed to be sucked out of the room as quickly as it was generated. His wife and children were huddled by the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces etched with fear. By the second day of the storm, the woodpile was half gone. By the third day, only a few precious logs remained. The temperature inside the cabin, his fortress against the winter, had dropped to just above freezing. The walls were coated in a thick layer of frost. He was a master builder, but he had been defeated by an enemy he could not see. The same scene played out in every other soddy and cabin. Families burned their furniture. They burned fence posts they had hauled from miles away. They burned precious tool handles. The meager smoke that escaped their chimneys was quickly torn apart and scattered by the raging wind. The community was failing. Their traditional methods, their collective wisdom, had proven to be a thin and brittle shield against the full fury of the plains. Desperation began to curdle into despair. They were isolated, freezing, and running out of time. In Alara's small home, the storm was a distant roar. The wind howled and battered her walls, But inside, a different world existed. Her sadi, smaller and thicker-walled than many others, held the heat remarkably well. The real miracle, however, was her stove. It glowed with a dull, cherry-red heat, radiating a steady, constant warmth throughout the single room. There was no frantic feeding of logs, no roaring inferno. Every few hours, Elara would calmly open the stove door, add a few more dried chips from the neat pile beside her, and close it again. The fuel burned slowly, evenly, releasing its stored energy with a quiet efficiency. Her children, Liam and Sophie, were not huddled in fear. Liam was on the floor, contentedly tracing patterns on a slate, while Sophie slept soundly in her small bed, a faint blush on her cheeks. The air was warm and still. The only sound within their walls was the gentle crackle of the embers and the soft hum of the wind outside, its fury muted by the thick sod. Elara's creation was being tested by the worst the world could throw at it, and it was holding. Her quiet work, her ridiculed idea, was proving to be the one true shelter in the storm. The contrast was absolute. In Thomas's cabin, the temperature was now below freezing. The last of his firewood was gone, and the fire in his stove was nothing more than a handful of dying, gray ashes. He and his family were in their beds, piled together for warmth, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. The cold was no longer just a discomfort, it was a mortal threat. He had built his home to withstand anything, but he had failed to account for the fuel to heat it. He had burned through 2 weeks' worth of wood in 3 days. In Elara's home, the temperature was a steady 60 degrees. She had not burned furniture or tool handles. She had used only a small fraction of the enormous pile of chips stacked against her outer wall. The mountain of fuel she had collected, the source of so much mockery, now represented something else entirely: survival. She had enough fuel to last for weeks, perhaps months, while her neighbors faced the terrifying prospect of freezing in their homes. Elara and her children were safe, warm, and calm. On the 4th day of the storm, a desperate thought pushed its way into Thomas's mind. It was a thought born of fear for his children and a tiny, nagging sliver of doubt about his own certainty. He thought of the widow, Elara. He pictured her small, isolated sadi, and a terrible image of her and her children, frozen solid, flashed in his mind. He felt a pang of guilt. He had mocked her, dismissed her. But what if, by some impossible chance, she had survived? What if her foolishness was not foolishness at all? Driven by a desperate need to know, and perhaps to help, he made a decision. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into the blizzard. The force of the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The air was so cold it felt like breathing needles. Visibility was near zero. He navigated by memory, his hand trailing along the wall of his own cabin, then stumbling through the deep, sculpted drifts toward where he knew Elara's home stood. It was a journey of less than 200 yards, but it felt like miles. He was fighting for every step, the wind tearing at him like a physical beast. When he finally saw the faint, dark shape of her sadi through the swirling snow, he noticed something strange. There was no smoke coming from her chimney. His heart sank. He had been right. The foul fuel had failed, or she had run out, and they had frozen. He stumbled to the door, his hand numb, and knocked weakly. He expected no answer. But then, he heard a sound from within, a shifting, and the wooden bar on the inside was lifted. The door opened a few inches. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It was not a blast of heat, but a gentle, enveloping wave of warm air that felt like a physical embrace. It was the most wonderful thing he had ever felt. He stared in disbelief at Elara, who stood in the doorway, her face calm. Behind her, he could see her son playing on the floor, and the room was bathed in the soft, steady glow of a lantern. There was no panic, no fear, There was only peace. "Thomas," she said, her voice full of surprise, "you should not be out in this." He was speechless. He pushed his way inside, shutting the door against the raging storm, and stood there, dripping melted snow onto her clean-swept floor. He looked around the small room, his eyes wide with shock. It was warmer in her tiny, ridiculed soddy than it had been in his own proud cabin, even before the storm. He saw the stove, glowing faintly, and the neat pile of dung beside it. He saw her children, healthy and safe. He had come expecting to find a tomb, but instead he had found a sanctuary. Ilara did not boast. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply saw the desperation and exhaustion on his face. She gestured to a small wooden stool near the stove. "Come," she said softly. "Sit. You are freezing." She poured him a cup of hot broth she had simmering on the stovetop. He took it with a trembling hand, the warmth seeping into his frozen fingers. He looked at the stove, then at the pile of chips, and then at her. He, the master builder, the voice of reason in the community, had been wrong. So profoundly, dangerously wrong. He was the fool. In that moment, his pride crumbled into dust, replaced by a deep and humbling awe. The blizzard finally broke 2 days later. The wind died down, and a weak, watery sun appeared in a sky of washed-out blue. The world was transformed, buried under immense, sculpted drifts of snow. Thomas returned to his own cabin, his mind reeling from what he had seen. He had taken a small sack of Ilara's fuel with him, enough to restart his own fire and bring a measure of life back to his frozen home. The warmth was a constant reminder of his own failure and her incredible success. When the paths were cleared and people began to emerge from their homes, blinking in the bright, cold light, the stories they told were of hardship and near disaster. Every family had a tale of running out of wood, of shivering in the dark, of their fear as the cold crept in. Then Thomas began to speak. He did not speak of his own suffering. He spoke of what he had found in the widow's home. He described the steady, miraculous warmth. He described her calm, her preparedness, and her endless supply of fuel. At first, they did not believe him. They thought the cold had affected his mind. But Thomas was a man whose word carried weight. His earnestness, his complete lack of his former arrogance, made them pause. He was not telling a story, he was giving a testimony. He gathered a few of the other men and led them through the deep snow to Ilara's soddy. They approached with skepticism, their faces grim. They knocked, and once again she opened the door. One by one, they stepped inside, out of the biting cold, and into the gentle, pervasive warmth. They saw what Thomas had seen: the glowing stove, the sleeping child, the quiet, ordered peace of a home that had conquered the winter. They looked at the pile of dried dung, the object of their ridicule, and they saw it for what it was: a treasure. Their laughter was replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. They had been fighting the prairie, trying to force it to yield wood. Ilara had listened to it, and it had given her its own answer. The next morning, Thomas returned to Ilara's home alone. He did not come with advice or warnings. He came with his hat in his hand, his shoulders slumped in a posture of humility. He stood before her, a giant of a man made small by his own ignorance. He looked at her, this quiet woman he had dismissed as a fool, and he said the 2 words he never thought he would say to her: "Teach me." Ilara simply nodded. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet grace. She took him outside and showed him her pile of fuel. She explained how to choose the right kind, how to tell if it was dry enough. She showed him her modified stove, the fine-holed grate she had made. She explained how to stack the chips for a long, slow burn. She answered his every question with patience and clarity. She shared her knowledge as freely as the prairie wind, holding nothing back. She gave away the secret to her survival without asking for anything in return. Word spread through the settlement with the speed of a revelation. Thomas, the skeptic, had become the student. He went from house to house, telling everyone what he had learned. Soon, a steady stream of visitors made their way to Alara's door. Men who had laughed at her now stood quietly, listening intently as she explained her methods. Women who had pitied her now looked at her with a profound, newfound respect. They saw not a fragile widow, but a woman of immense strength and wisdom. The entire community, humbled by the blizzard that had nearly broken them, came to learn from the one person they had all dismissed. That spring, the landscape of Providence began to change. The men did not organize wagon trains to the distant river. Instead, families fanned out across the prairie, their sacks and wheelbarrows in tow. The spring thaw revealed a bounty of bison and cattle chips, dried and cured by the winter winds. The gathering of fuel became a communal activity. The sound of laughter returned to the prairie, but it was a different kind of laughter now, not of mockery, but of shared work and shared hope. Blacksmiths were kept busy for weeks, fashioning new, fine-holed grates for every stove in the settlement. Carpenters built drying sheds, modeled after Alara's simple lean-to, next to every sod house. The strange, dark piles of fuel became a common sight, no longer a symbol of one woman's foolishness, but a badge of the community's newfound wisdom. The physical landscape of their lives had been remade by a single, simple idea. They were no longer dependent on the scarce trees of the river. They were fueled by the endless bounty of the plains themselves. The story of the widow and her fire spread beyond the small settlement. Travelers passing through on their way further west would notice the curious absence of woodpiles and the ubiquitous stacks of dried dung. They would ask, and the people of Providence would tell them the story of the great blizzard of '83. They would tell of their own pride and ignorance, and of the quiet woman who had saved them all by seeing what they could not. The travelers took the story and the idea with them. The knowledge passed from one settlement to another, a quiet, uncredited gift that saved countless lives on the vast, treeless expanse of the American plains. The following winter came, and it was just as harsh as the one before. The wind howled with the same fury, and the snow fell in the same blinding sheets. But this time, the settlement of Providence was ready. This time, every home was filled with the same steady, radiant warmth that had once been unique to Alara's Sadi. This time, there was no fear, no desperation. There was only the quiet confidence of a community that had learned its lesson. Alara never sought credit or praise. She remained a quiet member of the community, but she was no longer an outsider. She was their heart, the keeper of the simple wisdom that now sustained them. Thomas became her greatest advocate, always the first to credit her when newcomers asked about their methods. He had learned more from her than just how to build a fire. He had learned the hard lesson of humility, the wisdom of listening to a voice that speaks softly, and the courage to admit when you are wrong. Years later, when the railroad finally came through and brought with it cars full of cheap coal, many of the settlers switched to the new fuel. It was easier, more modern. But they never forgot. The drying sheds remained, and many of the older folks continued to burn the prairie chips, more out of habit and respect than necessity. The story of the woman who heated her home with what others despised became a founding legend of the town, a piece of their collective soul. It was a reminder that survival is not always about strength, but about vision. It is about seeing the gift that lies at your feet when everyone else is looking at the horizon. The final lesson was not about fuel or fire. It was about the nature of wisdom itself. It taught them that true knowledge is often quiet, unassuming, and found in the most unlikely of places. It is the courage to trust what you know in the face of ridicule, and the grace to share that knowledge freely when the world is finally ready to listen. The harshest land provides its own solutions, but only to those with the humility to see them. Ilara's legacy was not written in books or carved in stone. It was written in the warmth of 100 homes on a cold winter's night, a testament to the quiet innovator who looked at the empty prairie and saw not a problem, but an answer.